The fall of 1978 brought a different kind of cold to the small mountain town of Ridgeview. It wasn't just the weather that made people shiver. Something was about to happen that would haunt this quiet place for more than 2 decades. 23 years old and starting over. That's where her story begins. She had moved to Ridgeview just 6 months before everything changed. The kind of fresh start people dream about when life gets too heavy in one place. A painful divorce had pushed her toward these mountains, hoping the fresh air and simple life would help her heal. The town itself was nothing special. One main street, a handful of shops, and people who knew each other's business maybe a little too well. She found work at the corner diner, the kind of place where coffee was always hot and the regulars had their own seats. Her apartment sat right above the old hardware store downtown. Small, but it was hers. She could hear the bell on the shop door jingle throughout the day, a sound that somehow made her feel less alone. Her co-workers at the diner liked her well enough. She was quiet, kept to herself mostly, but she had a kind smile for the customers. The type of person who remembered how you liked your eggs or if you took cream in your coffee. Nothing flashy, just steady and reliable. The kind of employee every small-town restaurant needs. October 14th started like any other day. The morning shift came and went. Lunch rush kept everyone moving. By evening, the diner had settled into its usual rhythm. Just a few tables occupied, locals mostly, faces she'd come to recognize over the past months. But something was different about her that night. Her manager noticed it first. The way her hands shook slightly as she tied her apron strings, how she kept glancing at the clock on the wall, like she was either eager for something or dreading it, maybe both. Around 8 in the evening, she finished wiping down her last table. The fluorescent lights of the diner hummed above her head as she hung up her apron in the back room. Her co-worker was restocking napkins when she mentioned, almost casually, that she was meeting someone after work. "Got plans tonight?" her co-worker had asked, just making conversation. "Yeah, meeting someone," she replied, her voice a bit strained. She didn't offer more details. Didn't say who or where, just that she was meeting someone. Her co-worker remembered thinking she seemed nervous. Not excited nervous like a first date, more like worried nervous. The kind of tension you carry in your shoulders when you're not sure how something's going to go. But it was the end of a long shift. Everyone was tired, and the moment passed without much thought. She walked out the back door of the diner at 8:30. The parking lot was barely lit, just one street lamp casting long shadows across the gravel. A few people saw her get into her car, a blue sedan that she'd bought used when she first moved to town. The engine started up fine. The taillights glowed red as she pulled out onto Main Street. And that was it. The last time anyone in Ridgeview saw her alive. The next morning, the diner opened at 6 like always. By 6:30, the manager was annoyed. By 7, he was worried. She'd never missed a shift without calling. Never been late without a reason. He tried calling her apartment. The phone rang and rang, no answer. By noon, when she still hadn't shown up or called, the manager decided to check on her. He walked down Main Street to the hardware store and went up the narrow stairs to her apartment. He knocked, called her name. Nothing. The hardware store owner had a spare key for emergencies. They decided this qualified. The door swung open to reveal an apartment frozen in time. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, wallet inside with her ID and some cash. The bed was made. Dishes from breakfast, maybe 2 days old, sat in the sink. Her work shoes were by the door. Everything normal, everything in place, except she wasn't there. And her car was gone. The manager called the police. In a town the size of Ridgeview, it didn't take long for Detective Frank Morrison to arrive. He was in his early 50s then, a career cop who'd seen his share of missing person cases. Most of them ended with someone showing up a few days later with a sheepish explanation. But something about this felt different. Morrison started asking questions. He talked to the diner staff, the neighbors, anyone who might have seen something. Her co-worker mentioned the plans to meet someone but couldn't say who. No one else had heard her mention any appointment or date. The detective tracked down her ex-husband, still living 3 counties over. Bitter divorce, sure, but the man had been at work during the time she disappeared. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. Dead end. Days turned into weeks. Morrison put out bulletins for her car. Checked hospitals, bus stations, anywhere she might have gone. He interviewed everyone in town twice, then 3 times. The story was always the same. Nice girl, quiet, kept to herself. No enemies that anyone knew of. Her mother drove up from the city, desperate and pleading. She sat in Morrison's office with red eyes and trembling hands, begging him to find her daughter. They'd had their difficulties over the years, like all mothers and daughters do, but this woman had already lost a husband to cancer. Losing her only child might just break her completely. Morrison worked the case hard for months. He felt it in his gut that something bad had happened. People don't just vanish into thin air, leaving behind their whole life like that. But without leads, without witnesses, without a body or a crime scene, there was only so much he could do. By spring of 1979, the case had gone cold. The file sat on Morrison's desk for a while longer, then eventually moved to the cabinet. Then to storage. The town slowly stopped talking about her. Life moved on the way it always does, even when questions remain unanswered. Her mother never stopped looking. She hired private investigators when she could afford it, posted flyers in neighboring towns, called the police station every few months hoping for news that never came. But hope is a hard thing to hold on to when years pass and the silence stretches on. The diner got a new waitress. The apartment above the hardware store got a new tenant. The parking space where her blue sedan used to sit was filled by someone else's car. Ridgeview kept turning, kept living, kept forgetting. But the mountains remember everything. They just take their time telling their secrets. 22 years is a long time. Long enough for a whole generation to grow up. Long enough for a town to change its face completely. Long enough for memories to fade into nothing more than whispers. Ridgeview in the year 2000 looked different than it did in 1978. The old hardware store had closed down years ago, replaced by a gift shop that sold mountain souvenirs to tourists. The corner diner had changed hands twice, first to a couple from out of state who couldn't make it work, then to a local family who turned it into more of a cafe with fancy coffee drinks and free Wi-Fi. The tourists started coming in the late 80s. Someone wrote an article about the scenic mountain roads, and suddenly, Ridgeview wasn't just a forgotten little town anymore. Bed and breakfasts opened up, a couple of antique shops, an art gallery run by a woman from California who fell in love with the views. Detective Morrison had retired in 1995, hung up his badge at 62, and tried to enjoy his golden years. But retirement is funny. It gives you too much time to think. Too much time to remember the cases that got away. He kept a cardboard box in his attic. His wife had asked him about it once early on. "Why don't you just throw that old stuff away?" She'd said, but he couldn't. Inside that box were files, photographs, notes written in his own handwriting from interviews conducted decades ago. The case that never let him sleep quite right. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Morrison would climb those attic stairs. He'd sit on an old chair up there, dust floating in the beam of his flashlight, and go through those papers one more time, looking for something he missed, some detail that would make it all make sense. Her mother had moved to a nursing home 5 years earlier. The searching had taken everything out of her. All that hope, all those years of waiting by the phone, checking the mail for letters that never came. Her health had declined slowly at first, then all at once. By 2000, she was in a wheelchair, her mind starting to slip in and out like a radio signal in the mountains. She kept a photograph on her nightstand, faded now, the colors all wrong from age and sunlight. But she'd look at it every day and remember when her daughter was young. Before the divorce, before Ridgeview, before everything went dark, the town itself barely remembered anymore. A few old-timers might mention it if the topic of unsolved mysteries came up, but most of the people walking down Main Street in 2000 had never heard the story. They didn't know that someone had vanished from this very street 22 years ago. They didn't know that a mother was still waiting for answers. Life just moved on. That's what it does. The world doesn't stop spinning because one person disappears. But those mountains surrounding Ridgeview, they held their secrets close. Highway 9, the winding road that cut through the peaks and valleys, had been causing problems for years. The county engineers kept putting it on their list of things to fix. Erosion was getting bad. Every winter brought heavy snow, every spring brought rain, and little by little the mountainside was slipping. Budget meetings would roll around and someone would bring up Highway 9. "We really need to reinforce those slopes," they'd say. And everyone would nod and agree. Then they'd look at the numbers and decide it could wait another year. There were schools that needed repairs, bridges that needed attention. Always something more urgent than a mountain road that hadn't collapsed yet. The year 2000 started out normal enough. January was cold. February brought some snow. But March decided to make up for lost time. The rain started on March 25th, a Saturday. Not unusual for that time of year. Mountain weather is unpredictable. But this rain didn't stop. Sunday it rained. Monday it rained harder. By Tuesday, the ground was so saturated that water was running down the streets of Ridgeview like rivers. Storm drains couldn't keep up. Basements were flooding. The fire department was going door to door in the low-lying areas, helping people move their belongings to higher ground. Highway 9 was still open, but the county had put up warning signs. Drive at your own risk. Possible rock slides. The smart locals knew to avoid it during weather like this, but truckers still used it, and tourists who didn't know better would try to push through. By Wednesday morning, March 28th, the rain had finally stopped. The sun came out for the first time in days, and people in Ridgeview stepped outside to assess the damage. Trees were down. Power lines sagged. The creek that ran through town was swollen and angry, moving 3 times faster than normal. Up on Highway 9 around mile marker 47, something had been building. All that water, all that weight pressing down on saturated earth. The mountain had been holding on, but barely. And just after noon on that Wednesday, it let go. The sound was like thunder, but deeper, longer. People in town heard it and looked up at the mountains, wondering if they should be worried. A few miles away, a trucker on Highway 9 saw it happening in his rearview mirror and pushed his accelerator to the floor. Racing ahead of the wall of mud and rock that was chasing him down the road, he made it, barely. Then he pulled over, hands shaking, and called 911. The landslide had covered both lanes of Highway 9 for nearly 200 feet. Mud, rocks, whole trees, all of it piled 10 feet high in some places. No one was hurt, thankfully. The road had been mostly empty when it happened. But now the main route through the mountains was completely blocked. The county highway department got the call around 1 in the afternoon. They mobilized a crew, brought in heavy equipment, and headed up to mile marker 47. It would take days to clear, maybe even weeks depending on how unstable the slope was. But they'd done this before. Just another day in mountain country. The crew chief was a man named Tommy Valdez. He'd been working for the highway department for 15 years. Seen plenty of slides, cleared plenty of roads. He climbed into his excavator around 2:30 that afternoon, fired up the engine, and started moving earth. The bucket dug in, lifted, dumped. Dig, lift, dump. Rhythmic and steady. Just another job. The sun was warm on his shoulders. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Another scoop, another load of mud and debris. Then his bucket hit something that made a sound metal shouldn't make when it hits rock. Tommy stopped, backed up the excavator, climbed down to take a closer look. At first he thought it might be an old barrel, maybe some farm equipment that had been dumped years ago. But as he and another worker cleared away some of the mud by hand, Tommy saw the curve of it. The shape of it. The rust-covered remains of what had once been painted blue. It was a car roof. Tommy's heart started beating faster. He called over the crew chief. They carefully, very carefully, started removing mud from around it, and as more of the vehicle emerged from decades of burial, they could see it was old, really old, covered in rust and sediment, wrapped in tree roots that had grown through the windows. The crew chief radioed for the police. Because when you find a car buried in a mountainside, there's usually only one reason it's there. And suddenly, after 22 years of silence, the mountain was ready to talk. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 sheriff's deputies in a patrol car, followed shortly by an investigator from the county. They parked along the shoulder of Highway 9, emergency lights painting everything blue and red, and walked carefully toward where the highway crew stood waiting. Tommy Valdez showed them what he'd found. Even with some of the mud cleared away, it was hard to make out much detail. The car looked like it had been down there forever. Rust had eaten through parts of the body. The windows were caked with dirt. Tree roots had grown around it like the mountain was trying to pull it deeper into the earth. The investigator, a woman who'd seen her share of bad situations, knelt down beside the partially uncovered vehicle. She pulled on latex gloves and carefully wiped away some of the grime from what remained of the rear license plate. The numbers were barely visible, corroded and faded, but she could make out enough. She pulled out her radio and called it in. Back at the station, someone would run those numbers through the system. It wouldn't take long to find out who this car belonged to, or at least who it used to belong to. The crew stood around, nobody quite sure what to do. You don't just keep digging when you've found something like this. The whole site had become a potential crime scene. Yellow tape went up. The excavator sat silent, its work suspended. Traffic was already being diverted, but now the road closure would last much longer than anyone had planned. 30 minutes later, the investigator's radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end sounded strange, like the dispatcher couldn't quite believe what she was reading. The plates belonged to a 1975 Ford Pinto, blue in color, registered to a 23-year-old woman who'd been reported missing in October of 1978, 22 years. The car had been buried in this mountainside for 22 years. Word spread through the sheriff's department like wildfire. Some of the younger deputies had never heard the story, but there were a few old-timers still around, guys who'd been rookies back in '78, and they remembered. They remembered the search, the interviews, the way the case had consumed everyone for months before eventually going cold. Someone thought to call Detective Morrison. He was retired now, living in a house on the other side of town, but this was still his case. Would always be his case, really. The sheriff himself made the call. Morrison was in his garden when the phone rang. 74 years old, knees that didn't work like they used to, but still sharp as ever. He listened to what the sheriff was saying, and for a moment he couldn't speak. After all these years, after all this time, he told the sheriff he'd be there in 15 minutes. He made it in 10. The scene at mile marker 47 had grown. More deputies. The county coroner had arrived. A forensics team was being called in from the state police. This wasn't just a recovery operation anymore. This was history coming back to life. Morrison stood at the edge of the excavation site, looking down at the rusted shell of the car. He was older now, grayer, more tired, but standing there he was that 52-year-old detective again, the one who'd walked through that empty apartment above the hardware store and known something terrible had happened. The forensics team worked slowly, carefully. They couldn't just dig it out with heavy machinery. Everything had to be documented, photographed, preserved. The car had become a time capsule, and they needed to extract every bit of information it could give them. By late afternoon, they'd cleared enough earth to see the full vehicle. It sat at a steep angle, nose down, like it had tumbled down the mountainside and come to rest against the rocks. The driver's side was crushed pretty badly. The windshield was gone, just empty space where glass used to be. Mud and debris had filled the interior completely. The recovery would take days, they decided. They set up lights as the sun started to sink behind the mountains. Some of the team would work through the night. This was too important to wait. Morrison stayed as long as they'd let him. He wasn't official anymore, had no real authority, but nobody had the heart to send him away. He'd earned the right to be there. The sheriff brought him coffee and they stood together, watching the forensics team work in the harsh glare of the portable lights. By midnight, they'd reached the interior of the car. The mud was carefully removed bit by bit with hand tools and brushes, like archaeologists uncovering something ancient. And in a way, that's exactly what they were doing. The lead forensic investigator was a man who'd done this work for 20 years. He'd seen things that would give most people nightmares. But even he felt the weight of this moment. Somewhere in this car were answers that a family had been waiting decades to hear. They found her around 2 a.m. The remains were exactly where you'd expect them to be. In the driver's seat, still held in place by the seatbelt that had long since rotted. 22 years in the earth changes everything. But bones tell stories that nothing else can. The coroner came forward with his team. The recovery was delicate work, reverent almost. Every bone, every fragment carefully documented and removed. Morrison watched from a distance, his coffee long since gone cold in his hands. All those years of wondering, of lying awake at night going through the files in his head. And here was the answer. Here's where she'd been all along, but that wasn't all they found. As they carefully cleared the passenger side of the vehicle, something became clear. The forensic investigator paused, called over the coroner, and they conferred in low voices. Morrison saw their body language change, saw the way they looked at each other. The lead investigator walked over to where Morrison and the sheriff stood. His face was serious in the harsh artificial light. "There's someone else in the car," he said quietly. "Passenger seat. Another set of remains." The words hung in the air like fog. Morrison felt something cold run down his spine. All these years he'd imagined 100 different scenarios, but never this. Never two people. Who? The sheriff asked, but they all knew there was no immediate answer to that question. The night stretched on. More careful work, more photographs, more evidence bags. The second set of remains was recovered with the same care as the first. The coroner would need dental records, DNA if possible. It would take time to identify who this second person was. But there were other things found in that car. Things that made Morrison's detective instincts come alive again after all these years of retirement. Personal effects, corroded and damaged but still recognizable. A wallet in the passenger side. Papers in what remained of the glove compartment. And something else, something that changed everything, a gun. Rusted almost beyond recognition but unmistakably a revolver. Lying on the floor of the car between the two front seats. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the pieces of a 22-year-old mystery were finally coming together. But the story they told was more complicated than anyone had imagined. The mountain had kept its secret well. But now, in the light of a new day, the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the darkness where it had hidden for more than 2 decades. And that truth would change everything. The news spread through Ridgeview faster than wildfire. By mid-morning, everyone knew. The missing waitress from 1978 had been found, and she hadn't been alone. The local news crews arrived first, satellite vans clogging up the narrow shoulder of Highway 9. Then came the bigger stations from the city, helicopters circling overhead trying to get footage. The sheriff had to assign extra deputies just to keep the media back from the crime scene. Morrison barely slept that first night. His mind was racing, turning over possibilities, trying to make sense of what they'd found. 2 people in that car, a gun. After 22 years of nothing, suddenly there was too much information and not enough answers. The forensics lab worked around the clock. The coroner's office prioritized everything from the car. Dental records were pulled from archives. The gun was sent to ballistics. Every piece of evidence was photographed, cataloged, analyzed. 3 days after the discovery, they got their first major breakthrough. The dental records came back on the second body. It was a man, 41 years old when he died. His name had been in the missing persons database too, reported missing just 3 days after the young woman disappeared. But here's the thing that made Morrison's heart skip. This man had been reported missing in a different county, different jurisdiction, different police department. Back in 1978, nobody had connected the 2 cases. Why would they? People go missing all the time. 2 separate cases, 2 separate investigations. No obvious connection, except now they were together at the bottom of a ravine, and that couldn't be a coincidence. Morrison drove to the station every day, even though he had no official reason to be there. The current investigators were good people. They kept him in the loop. They understood this case belonged to him in a way that went beyond paperwork and jurisdiction. They pulled the man's old file from storage. It was thin, not much there. He'd been living alone, no close family to push for answers. His landlord had reported him missing when the rent went unpaid. His car had been found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot 2 counties over. At the time, investigators figured he'd just taken off, started over somewhere else. People did that sometimes, but his history told a different story. Morrison read through the file with growing anger at himself for missing this years ago. The man had a record. Assault charges from 5 years before he disappeared. A restraining order from a woman who said he'd been following her, showing up at her work, leaving things at her door. The restraining order had expired by 1978. The assault charges had been pleaded down. He'd done some jail time, got out, kept his head down. On paper, he'd stayed clean. But men like that don't just change. The current lead investigator, a sharp woman in her 40s, started digging deeper. She pulled records from the corner diner, old receipts and logs that had been boxed up and stored when the ownership changed. It took her 2 days, but she found something. The man's name on credit card receipts. He'd been eating at the diner regularly in the months before both disappearances. Morrison closed his eyes when she told him. He'd interviewed everyone at that diner. Twice, 3 times. But he'd been asking about the missing woman, about people she knew, about anyone who might have had a problem with her. He hadn't asked about random customers, hadn't thought to look at every single person who walked through those doors. They started interviewing people again. Most of the staff from 1978 were long gone. moved away or passed on. But they found a few: an old cook who'd retired to Florida, a dishwasher who now owned his own restaurant across town, and they found her former coworker, the last person she'd spoken to before walking out of the diner that October night. The woman was in her 60s now, working at a doctor's office, living a quiet life. She agreed to come in and talk. She sat across from the investigators in the same room where Morrison had interviewed her 22 years earlier. Her memory wasn't perfect, but some things stuck with you. She remembered how nervous the missing woman had seemed that last night. The trembling hands, the glances at the clock. Then the investigator showed her a photo, an old driver's license picture of the man they'd found in the car. "Do you remember ever seeing this person at the diner?" The woman stared at the photo for a long time. Her hand went to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He was there all the time. Always sat in her section, just watched her. She mentioned it once, said it made her uncomfortable. I told her maybe he just had a crush, you know? Harmless. Nothing about it had been harmless. The ballistics report came back on the gun. It had been fired once. They'd recovered a single bullet from the second set of remains, specifically from the skull. The bullet matched the gun. Morrison sat in the sheriff's office when they got that news, and something clicked into place in his head. "Check the phone records," he said suddenly. From October 78, the station's phone records. It took some doing. Records that old weren't digital, but they found them in a dusty box in the basement. Handwritten logs of incoming calls. And there it was. A call to the police station on October 14th, 1978, the day she disappeared. Time stamped at 7:45 in the evening, 45 minutes before she left work. The call had lasted 3 seconds. Hung up before anyone answered. She'd tried to call for help. Something had been happening. Something that scared her enough to dial the police. But she'd hung up. Maybe she heard someone coming. Maybe she changed her mind. Maybe she thought she could handle it herself. They pulled more records. Her apartment building had a payphone in the hallway. The call had come from there. She'd gone home after her shift started, probably during her break. Called the police, hung up, then went back to work and finished her shift, nervous and shaking. The investigators built a timeline. She'd known something was wrong. This man, this customer who watched her at work, he'd been escalating, maybe following her home, maybe leaving things for her, calling her, showing up places he shouldn't be. The kind of behavior that makes your skin crawl but doesn't quite seem illegal enough to report. Until it did. Until she got scared enough to call the police. But not scared enough to stay on the line. After work that night, she'd told her coworker she was meeting someone. Not a date, not excitement. Meeting someone. Like an appointment. Like something she had to do. Morrison thought he understood now. She was going to confront him. Tell him to leave her alone. Maybe she'd gotten the gun by then. Borrowed it from a friend or bought it herself. Protection. She was going to meet him somewhere and tell him it was over. This stalking had to stop, but the meeting place wasn't in town. The crash site was 7 miles out on Highway 9, in the middle of nowhere. Dark, isolated, no houses for miles. She'd driven out there that night, and he'd followed. Or maybe he'd been waiting. Maybe he'd told her where to meet. Somewhere private where they could talk. The physical evidence told them what happened next, but the exact sequence would always be partly guesswork. The scrape marks on the rear bumper of her car showed impact from another vehicle. He'd forced her off the road or chased her until she lost control. The car had gone over the edge, tumbled down that steep embankment, crashed at the bottom. Both of them survived the initial crash. Injured, trapped, but alive, and in that wrecked car at the bottom of a dark ravine with no one around to hear, the final confrontation had happened. She'd had the gun. Even hurt, even scared, she'd fought back. One shot, that's all it took, and that's all they found. One bullet, one target, but the crash had done its damage. Injuries, exposure, the impossibility of climbing back up that steep, muddy slope in the darkness. The mountain had claimed them both that night, and then slowly buried the evidence of what had happened, earth sliding down year after year, trees growing, the forest reclaiming what had always been its own. 22 years of silence finally broken. The truth was terrible, but at least it was truth. The hardest part was telling her mother. She was 89 years old now, living in a nursing home 30 miles from Ridgeview. Her mind wasn't what it used to be. Some days she was sharp as a tack. Other days she thought it was still 1985 and kept asking when her daughter was coming to visit. The sheriff and Morrison drove there together on a Friday morning. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. What do you say to a mother who's been waiting 22 years for news? How do you tell her that the answer finally came, but it's not the answer anyone wanted? The nursing home was nice enough. Clean, bright, flowers in the windows. They found her in the common room, sitting by a window in her wheelchair. The photograph was on her lap. The same one she'd kept all these years, faded and worn from being held so many times. She looked up when they walked in, and somehow, without them saying a word, she knew. You could see it in her face. That look mothers get when they know something terrible has happened to their child. Morrison pulled up a chair, sat down next to her. He'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head on the drive over, but now all those careful words were gone, so he just told her, simple and plain. They'd found her daughter, found her car on Highway 9 buried in the mountainside. She'd been there all along. The old woman didn't cry at first. She just sat very still, holding that photograph. Then she asked the question Morrison had been dreading. Did she suffer? He thought about lying, thought about making it easier, but this woman had earned the truth, whatever it was. So he told her everything. About the man who'd been following her daughter, about the car being forced off the road, about the gun, and what it meant. She fought back, Morrison said quietly. She didn't give up.
Even at the end, she fought. That's when the tears came.
The old woman clutched the photograph to her chest and wept. Not the wild sobbing you might expect, but something quieter and deeper. The sound of a heart that had been breaking slowly for 22 years finally splitting completely open. But then, through the tears, she said something Morrison would never forget. My girl was strong. I always knew that. Whatever happened out there, she didn't go easy. That's my girl. There was pride in her voice. Grief and pain, yes, but pride too. Her daughter hadn't been a victim who gave up. She'd been a fighter who ran out of time. They sat with her for an hour, answered her questions as best they could, promised her that her daughter could finally be laid to rest properly. After all these years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe she was out there somewhere alive, there could finally be closure. The old woman asked for one thing. She wanted to see where it happened, just once before the end. Morrison promised he'd make it happen. 2 weeks later, on a clear Sunday morning, they drove her out to mile marker 47. The road had been reopened by then, the landslide cleared, though you could still see the scar on the mountainside where the earth had given way. They wheeled her as close to the edge as they safely could. She sat there for a long time, just looking down at the ravine below. The forest was thick and green. Birds were singing. It was peaceful in its way. She loved the mountains, the old woman said softly. When she first moved here, she'd call me and tell me about the views. How pretty everything was. I guess she never really left them. The funeral was held 3 weeks after the discovery. The whole town turned out. People who'd known her, people who'd only heard the stories, people who just felt the weight of a tragedy finally reaching its end. Morrison stood in the back of the church. He wasn't family, wasn't anything official anymore, but he needed to be there, needed to see this through to the end. The case that had haunted him for more than 20 years was finally closed. The investigation wrapped up officially in early May. The forensics team had done their work. The evidence had been collected and analyzed. The reports were written. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. A stalker had escalated to violence. A young woman had defended herself. And the mountain had buried them both. The man's family, what little there was of them, didn't come forward. A distant cousin was contacted but wanted nothing to do with it. Didn't want to claim the remains. Didn't want to answer questions about a relative they barely knew. In the end, the county buried him in an unmarked grave. Some people don't deserve to be remembered, but she was remembered. A memorial was placed near mile marker 47, a simple stone marker with her name and dates. It read, "Gone but never forgotten. May she rest in peace." Morrison visited it sometimes. He'd park his truck on the shoulder and walk over to the marker. Stand there for a while thinking about all the what-ifs. What if she'd stayed on the line when she called the police? What if he'd dug deeper into every single person at that diner? What if the landslide had happened 20 years earlier? But what-ifs don't change anything. They're just ghosts of possibilities that never were. The old woman's health declined rapidly after the funeral. It was like she'd been holding on all those years just to know the truth, and now that she had it, she could finally let go. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, the photograph still on her nightstand. Morrison attended that funeral too. It was smaller, quieter, just a handful of people who'd known her. When it was over, he stood by the grave for a while. Mother and daughter buried side by side now, together again after all those years apart. He thought about all the cases he'd worked over his career, the ones he'd solved, the ones he hadn't. But this one had been different. This one had stayed with him every single day for 22 years. A voice in the back of his head asking what he'd missed, what he could have done differently. The truth didn't make him feel better exactly. Didn't ease the guilt of not finding her sooner. But at least the question mark was gone. At least there were answers where before there had only been silence. Ridgeview moved on, the way towns do. The story faded from the news. The tourists kept coming, snapping photos of the mountains, never knowing that one of those peaks had held a dark secret for more than 2 decades. Life continued its steady march forward. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees around mile marker 47, locals will tell you they hear something. Not quite a sound, more like a feeling. A reminder that the mountains remember everything, even when we forget. Morrison passed away himself 5 years later, at the age of 79. His family found the box in the attic when they were cleaning out his house. All those files, all those notes, all those photographs, the case that had consumed so much of his life. They donated it all to the County Historical Society, a record of a time when a young woman disappeared, a town searched for answers, and a retired detective never stopped trying to bring her home. Because that's what it was really about. Not just solving a case or closing a file. It was about a person. A 23-year-old woman who'd moved to the mountains looking for a fresh start, and instead found tragedy. A mother who'd never stopped hoping. A community that had never forgotten. The truth took 22 years to surface, but it finally did. And sometimes that's all we can ask for. The truth, even when it hurts. Even when it comes too late to change anything. Because knowing is better than wondering. Always. The mountains keep their secrets well, but they don't keep them forever. And when the earth finally shifts and the truth comes spilling out, all we can do is listen, remember, and honor those who were lost in the silence.